Building a better breakfast pastry, cinnamon rolls. We were asked to create a breakfast pastry that has 5 grams of saturated fat, 320 milligrams of sodium, 10 grams of sugar per serving, and it also needs to be comprised of 50% whole grain flour and be under 350 calories. We had to replace our butter with a fat with less saturated fats, replace half of our flour with a whole grain, and reduce our added sugars by reimagining the filling using natural sweeteners, all while keeping the dough soft and the filling flavorful. We decided to use sunflower oil as our replacement for butter, replace half of the all-purpose flour with spelt flour, and only use natural sweeteners for the filling, which included dates. Replacing the filling with a natural sugar, which we use date paste, and a fat with low saturated fats, in which we use sunflower oil, we were able to replace a cinnamon roll filling that was still able to be enjoyed. Our major findings were that making small swaps in ingredients can greatly improve the health of pastry. Using an oil in the dough improved the texture and had no significant impact on the flavor. One of our biggest findings was how much of a difference hydration can make in a dough. The hydration in our dough was too low once we replaced half of the flour with fresh ground spelt, so we upped the hydration by 5%, and this allowed the wheat to become more hydrated and resulted in a better, softer texture. We also found that replacing the filling with a date paste created a sweet and moist filling that satisfied sweet tooth without the added sugar.
Research objective. For our project, we chose cinnamon rolls. They originated from Sweden and were called kanelbulle. We chose cinnamon rolls because we wanted to take a classic breakfast pastry and explore healthier fillings than the original butter and sugar. We were keen on experimenting with the texture and the flavor of the dough as well. A few challenges that we would face during our experiment are: first, how to make the filling healthy and delicious. We wanted to make sure it connects to a cinnamon roll, but we couldn't afford to use butter and sugar due to the limited calorie count. Spelt flour adds a grainy or a nutty taste, which can either complement the cinnamon or repel with it. The spelt flour has a higher ratio of gliadin to glutenin, hence the gluten is more delicate and can crumble easier. As a result, we would have to be careful while handling the dough, as no vigorous kneading should take place. Another challenge would be to assess the texture and the flavor changes by replacing butter with oil completely. Here's our bibliography. Problem statement. How can we make a cinnamon roll that has 5 grams of saturated fat, 320 mg of sodium, and 10 grams of sugar per serving, in addition have 50% whole grain flour and is under 350 calories?
Hypothesis. If we use sunflower oil as a replacement for butter, replace half of the all-purpose flour with spelt flour, and only use natural sweeteners for the filling, we will be able to create a cinnamon roll that is healthier yet still delicious.
Experiment design variables.
Our main concerns to meet the requirements of the brief are the fat content, sugar content in the filling, and the whole grain aspect. For the fat content, our independent variable will be to replace the butter in the dough with sunflower oil, as it has less saturated fats than butter. For the sugar content in the filling, we are planning on replacing the brown sugar with a mixture of dates and other dried fruits that provide natural sweetness. The use of the dates will also provide moisture and texture that will mimic the butter. Finally, we plan on milling our own spelt berries and replacing 50% of the all-purpose flour with the fresh spelt flour.
Dependent variable. We would need to collect the data for the change in texture of the rolls by using spelt flour, and how does it differ from the control. Making people try the control and the spelt flour buns, we can draw conclusions onto what do they prefer. Likert type scale surveys will be conducted to exactly know the positioning of our product and what needs improvisation. Moreover, a spring test would also guide us in observing the textural changes between an increased hydrated dough, and a control dough. For the filling, we experimented quite a lot of flavors and decided on choosing the best two we liked and then conducting a taste test by the visitors in the school and our classmates. The appearance was also variable on deciding the filling, as some fillings looked different than the others once baked. The nutritional components will be measured through the food processor named ESHA. It will accurately guide us for the calorie count and saturated fat per serving. The final recipe will showcase the flour and the sugar percentage.
The principles of health that we decided to use based off of the menus of Change Sustainable menus are to choose healthier oils, to use good fat, not low fat, and to reduce added sugars. Our control ingredients that will stay the same in the experiment will be the amount of cinnamon, the use of milk, yeast, eggs, salt, and sugar in the dough. The special material and ingredients needed for this recipe is spelt flour, dates, sunflower oil, and a high velocity blender. On our first day in lab, we made 3 different variations. The control, then again the control dough with a date filling, and a dough with half of the butter replaced with sunflower oil, but still using the control filling. Using the guiding principle of using healthier oils, we decided to use sunflower oil because it is extremely low in saturated fats, unlike butter in our control recipe. We also found that the original date filling that we made did not provide the same effect as the control filling, and it needed more moisture. We also found that replacing butter with sunflower oil made the dough a little softer after being baked and had no real impact on the flavor. And you can see in the photos that the date filling just sort of acted like a glue and stuck the dough together. Our first survey asked questions about the dough that we made using half sunflower oil and half butter. The overall reaction was that there was no significant difference in the flavor, but that the texture was noticeably more soft. And you can see that in our results as well as the comments. In our second round of testing, we replaced half of the all-purpose flour with fresh milled spelt berries. We also tested the 2 different fillings tested on our previous batch, so just the control filling and then the same date filling that we made earlier. We found that the addition of the spelt flour made the rolls drier after being baked. The date filling retained the same properties as the trial with the previous batch, so it was still very dry and sticking the dough together, not allowing it to rise as much. And the date paste had no moisture. It just acted like a glue and kept everything in place in the oven. The next trials that we did played with the hydration of the dough as well as the filling. So the first batch that we did was made with the normal dough hydration, and we split it into 2, and we replaced all of the butter with oil since we knew that it was going to work with the oil. And then half of that dough we filled with the date filling that we had been using, and then the other half we made a new filling that had golden raisins. We decided to use golden raisins and dates because we were following the guiding principle of reducing added sugars, and raisins are known as nature's candy, so we wanted to try to use their sweetness. The next batch of dough was the same, with using 100% of sunflower oil instead of butter, but we increased the hydration by 5%. We still felt that the date filling on both doughs was not moist enough, and that the raisin flavor didn't blend well with the cinnamon and with the other flavors. But we really enjoyed the texture that came with the increased hydration. For our third survey, we asked about the texture of the dough with the 5% increased hydration versus the dough with the control hydration. The overall comments for suggestions on fillings were to add the cream cheese or something sweeter with more richness. And then these are the results of the questions about the hydration. So you can see that a majority of people liked the texture and the overall properties of A, which was the dough with the more hydration. So now that we had decided that we liked the texture of the dough with more hydration, we stuck with that. So the final dough that we used had a 5% increased hydration. We used 50% spelt flour and 100% sunflower oil. And we were lucky enough to have our control fit with the sugar and the salt parameters that were given to us. So we wanted to focus next on getting the filling correct. We split a batch of dough into 4 tests to test 4 different fillings. So the first was date sugar and cinnamon mixed together, sprinkled over sunflower oil that we spread over the dough to sort of mimic the original idea of cinnamon rolls with the butter spread and then cinnamon sugar sprinkled over. The next 3 were different versions of the date filling that we had been using in previous batches. So we started by rehydrating the dates using boiling water this time instead of just rehydrating them with room temperature water. And we allowed them to soften for longer. Then we blended them until they became more of a paste in the Vitamix instead of using a food processor. So then with the softer dates, we made one version that we replaced half of the date paste with banana puree. The other version we used a fresh apple puree, and then the final version was just all date paste with sunflower oil added to give a little bit of richness. And then all of the versions had the same amount of vanilla extract and cinnamon added to them. So for our third survey, we asked people how they felt about the apple filling in our cinnamon rolls. Overall, the feedback was great about how the pastry looked, the texture, and as well as the taste. Most of the comments said that the product was a little bit dry and they were missing a little bit of sweetness and moisture that comes with a cream cheese frosting. And we decided from the previous trials, that we weren't going to use the banana puree because it was very extremely overpowering, and then the date sugar also did not melt, and it stayed very dry after being baked. So this is our final survey for our final product, which happens to be the version out of the 4 trials that used all date paste and just an added sunflower oil element. So 90% of those surveys gave the texture of the cinnamon rolls a 4 or a 5. 90% completely agreed or agreed that the pastry looked nice, and 80% agreed that the pastry was delicious. Our overall comments were that it was not too sweet but satisfying for what our goal was. So this is a photo of our final cinnamon roll and our final recipe, and as you can see, almost everything kind of stayed the same except for those few swaps that we made. These are the nutrition facts between the control recipe and the better cinnamon roll. So you can see our saturated fat lowered from 7 grams to 1.5 grams per serving. Our sodium was reduced by 10 milligrams per serving, and our added sugars were also reduced by 10 grams per serving. And then overall, the calories were reduced by 10 calories per serving. So we were presented with the challenge of making a breakfast pastry that had no more than 5 grams of saturated fat, 320 milligrams of sodium, 10 grams of sugar, 350 calories per serving, and that used 50% whole grains and it tastes good. We proved our hypothesis to be correct through many trials and errors by replacing the filling with a natural sugar date paste and with a low in saturated fats, which we used sunflower oil. We were able to replicate a cinnamon roll filling that was still able to be enjoyed. According to our qualitative data, the filling was light, sweet, and tasty, and by replacing the butter with sunflower oil, we reduced the saturated fat significantly and improved the texture. According to one of our surveys, 33% felt a difference in texture due to the substitution of oil. According to another one of our surveys, 55.6% of people preferred the texture of the more hydrated dough over the normal hydration. We decided to increase the hydration of the dough since the use of whole grain flours requires more hydration due to the level of absorption of whole grains. With support from our surveys, we found that our idea of increasing the hydration resulted in a softer pastry that was comparable to the control.
Extension. First, we were struggling to find the right filling which tasted good as well as kept the product within the calorie parameters. We realized this midway of the project and how important a filling can be and what it can contribute to a product. If done next time, we would like to first calculate the nutritional benefits and then move forward with experimenting the fillings. Second, reduce the quantity produced by the recipe when testing the dough as it led to unwanted wastage. Third, the bulk fermentation of the dough took about an hour, plus the final fermentation took 45 to 50 minutes each time we experimented any dough. Hence, to finally get the result, the process was approximately 2.5 hours long. As a result, we couldn't make more dough till the time we knew how the first one came up. Hence, a faster way of proofing would save us time and speed up our experimental process. Application. First, increasing hydration affected our dough largely, and we were able to exactly get the texture we desired. Second, as the prompt suggested, the product should taste delicious. We realized the importance of any filling and how it largely affects the overall experience of consuming a product. We also believe any component added to a product should have a role, like fillings have a role to provide flavor and texture. Third, we learned the many benefits of spelt flour, like it's high in protein than whole wheat flour. It is also an excellent source of fiber and micronutrients such as calcium and vitamin E. Fourth, replacing sunflower oil with butter guided us back to the principle of choosing healthier oils. And removing sugar from the filling and using dates instead led us to the principle of reducing sugar. Lastly, the use of ingredients to make a healthier breakfast pastry, like replacing butter, using whole grain flour, and using dates. Questions to be investigated in further research. First, if the milk in the recipe was completely replaced by water, how much of the calories would be deducted and how would it affect flavor? Second, if AP flour was eliminated and whole wheat flour was used to increase the overall nutrition of the rolls, how would the gluten formation be different than the experiment conducted right now? Third, except dates, are there any other dried fruits which provide qualities replicating dates and add the sweetness as well? If so, how would they taste with cinnamon? Fourth, if hydration was further increased by 10%, would the liquid play with the structure of the dough?